right. So as we enter into the course proper, into the content of the course, we are moving into Module 2. So I'm going to scroll down here to get to Module 2. And Module 2 is all about starting our journey towards nonfiction writing. So this is a course where we're going to be doing a lot of nonfiction writing. We're going to learn how to write a variety of different kinds of essays. That's the purpose of SLU's English 1500 class, and it's certainly the purpose that we want to follow as we move through this semester. And to get us really started in that process, we're going to do an overview by looking at a lot of different kinds of essays. So as you can see, the course is laid out to get us to a descriptive essay. We're going to do compare and contrast. We're going to talk about argumentation. We're going to talk about listing. We're going to talk about a definition essay. We're going to talk about narrative essays. We're going to look at an essay that has a lot of those things kind of combined and talk about how to use a practice like footnotes. And then we're going to try our hand at one of these forms. But before we can really get there, you are going to start by thinking about what is an essay for you, right? So that's actually our activity for Monday. And as we're thinking about looking at some of these essay types, it's going to be really important that we look at our supplementary materials. Here I've put lots of good stuff about argumentation, about ethos, pathos, logos, and really about the rhetorical triangle. So let me talk about the rhetorical triangle because it is one of the central figures for the class. The concept behind the rhetorical triangle, we're actually using a twofold rhetorical triangle. If you were to go to Google and look up rhetorical triangle, you're most likely to see the traditional Aristotelian, that's Aristotle, ethos, pathos, and logos model. And we're also going to look at a separate model that's really effective for writing. So I'm going to talk about both of those different triangles today, but we can refer to them as the rhetorical triangle in one sense. One thing I want you to notice as the model here is that the rhetorical triangle is meant to be a balance of the three elements. Whichever three elements you're talking about, it's meant to be balanced in some way. So this is probably not a perfectly balanced triangle as I made it myself, but you can imagine for the sake of argument here that it's not skewed one way or another. It's meant to be balanced on all three sides. So let's go ahead and talk about the Aristotelian rhetorical triangle first. And we're going to start with the concept of ethos. So ethos is probably the trickiest one to really understand because ethos is really about having author credibility. I think ethos is particularly difficult for young writers because you haven't necessarily established yourselves yet. And so you don't necessarily have anything behind your reputation, right? Whereas I'm sure most of you heard my name or kind of knew of me before you took this course because I've been at Afton for a while, because I have a certain kind of reputation as a teacher. And that reputation, I think, is pretty positive. And so you kind of have a little bit of faith going into the class that it's going to be a positive experience. Or I think, we think of like Mr. Bully as being an exceptionally credible teacher, right? He's definitely a master of his content area. But you guys are going to have to rely on some other things to show that credibility. Traditionally, religion is one way that people have borrowed credibility in the past. So if you are trying to make an ethical argument, right, then you're going to say something like, God has created this religion. Here are the rules of the religion. I follow the rules because they have been created by God. So you're really saying like, my actions are true because they're God. They're stamped by God, right? Or they're enforced by God. Another way to think of this is just thinking about the military. If you're a soldier in the military, you're not supposed to question orders. The higher ups have a credibility. They know what they're doing, and so you follow orders because that is your mandate, right? Now, that can cut both ways, right? So If your religion and my religion don't agree with each other, we might have an ethical dilemma. Or if you're a soldier and you're just following orders and you do something horrible, then you're still accountable for that, right? And we hear these kinds of examples all the time. So I'm not suggesting that ethos is perfect, but it is a massive way that we kind of gain credibility. For you guys, probably a more realistic way that you're gaining credibility is if you're writing a paper about, a medical controversy, then you're relying on doctors and scientists, right? So you're relying on experts in the field. They have the credibility to kind of follow you. What gives them that credibility? Their university, their training, their certifications, etc. Let's go ahead and move down to logos. Logos is a little more easy to understand. It's the logical development. And what is logic? Logic is using evidence, using reasoning to convince your audience, right? Now, here's the nasty thing about logos. Doesn't always work, right? I think we're aware enough to know that even if you provide somebody with some really strong facts, like you should wear a mask in public to prevent the spread of COVID, there are people who are like, I don't care about your facts, not about me, so I don't need to listen to your argument, right? So logos, using those facts, providing that evidence, it's supposed to work, but does it always work? No. Pathos is using emotional leverage that will cause your audience to engage with you and your message. And here's the tricky thing. Pathos seems to work almost all of the time. If you can really get into somebody's head and anticipate what they want to hear, then they're more likely to listen to you. And so pathos is kind of, think of those grand speeches that are given at like the national conventions for Republicans and Democrats that are speaking to people who already agree with them, right? And they're going to hit that one talking point and they know there's going to be an applause line. Just pumps everybody up. It makes everybody feel good. And so we could see, like, if you're really in tune with your audience and you're telling them the things that they want you to hear, then they're gonna have a very positive response to you. Again, in theory, we would balance these things, but we know some of them are going to be more effective for some audiences. Going to the black parts here, this is really the writing part of the rhetorical triangle, and this is what we're going to talk about with audience, purpose, style, and structure. And so these are the things that are really going to keep us grounded throughout the year, and these three really do need to be very closely monitored. They need to be really in balance with each other, and I'll talk a little bit about what happens when they're not. So audience, it is who you are writing for, right? So as I'm still grading a lot of the papers from the summer, a lot of my feedback is based on this concept of audience. And as I say in most of that feedback, a lot of the times you guys have been conditioned that your teacher is your primary audience. And of course your teacher is your primary audience. Most of the time when you write or when you present something, your purpose is to show that you know it. That's your entire purpose, right? And so, of course, your teacher is your audience. They're going to determine whether you know it or not. However, that's not very effective if we're being authentic, right? So really thinking about who am I writing this to, taking that concept of persuading a peer that they need to write this book, a nice simple adjustment that almost nobody ever thinks of, but would be a really simple thing to do, is think, well, what about the students entering this class next year? Would I recommend this book to them for summer reading, right? So something very simple, very targeted audience, and thinking about how much of that is going to change your writing if you really know who you're talking to and how you're going to address them. Which is going to get me down to purpose, right? What is the message and why is it important? So the purpose of the piece, why am I writing it? Again, so often in your writing in the past, the purpose has all been about showing knowledge, right? Well, that's not really why a lot of people write. In fact, almost every professional writer is writing to engage an audience in some way, maybe get their meaning across, not their purpose across. The central idea of the piece is coming across, right? What idea do you want to sell to that audience, and how do you want to do that? The how do you want to do that is the style and the structure. So, as I alluded to before the rhetorical triangle talk, we're going to be looking at a lot of different kinds of structures on how to fill that purpose. So, are you going to fill that purpose by writing something narrative? Is your narrative experience going to speak to something that's then going to instruct some people on maybe a valuable life lesson? Is it important for you to compare and contrast something? And what do you want people to get out of that? There are really strong compare and contrast essay topics, and there are really weak ones, right? I would say, whether the iPhone or the Android phone is a better phone is not a very strong topic, right? At the end of the day, people are probably not going to change their mind about it. And let's face it, they're pretty much the exact same thing, even though I wouldn't give my iPhone up for anything in the world. So thinking about how we present that message and thinking about how do I make this unique to me, that's going to get to that style. The style is the unique to you part. The how am I going to do that is the structure part. So let's think a little bit about what happens when we have an imbalance. Well, if you have a paper that's too structured, then you're not really thinking about your audience and you're not thinking about your purpose. So there is a certain type of essay that's too structured. It's called the 5-paragraph essay, and I'm going to be taking that down a little later in this lecture series. So we're going to think about that. Having something that is all about your purpose and not really thinking about your audience, kind of all passion and no structure, or all passion and no thought of audience, this is what we call a rant, right? So if you've ever heard somebody kind of just go off on something, they clearly have a purpose in mind. It's usually not a very cohesive thought, right? It doesn't have a lot of that style structure involved in it. And yeah, maybe it starts to talk about an audience, but it loses that audience pretty quickly, and it just kind of becomes that rant place. Again, there's having too much audience focus, right? So if it's all about your audience and it's not about you at all, your message can really get lost. It can be too much about them. And in the worst case scenario, we can actually come up with like a really fake audience, and we can end up using that universal you, which is kind of like, I think I'm talking to people, but I'm not really talking to anybody at all. So again, rhetorical triangle, one of the most important concepts in the class, something we're going to keep coming back to as it's incredibly important and exceptionally important as we move into our first essays. Roger Engel. A baseball weighs just over 5 ounces and measures between 2.86 and 2.94 inches in diameter. It is made of a composition cork nucleus encased in 2 thin layers of rubber, one black and one red, surrounded by 121 yards of tightly wrapped blue-gray wool yarn, 45 yards of white wool yarn, 53 more yards of blue-gray wool yarn, 150 yards of fine cotton yarn, a coat of rubber cement, and a cowhide, formerly horsehide, exterior, which is held together with 216 slightly raised cotton stitches. Printed certifications, endorsements, and outdoor advertising spherically attest to its authenticity. Pick it up, and it instantly suggests its purpose. It is meant to be thrown a considerable distance, thrown hard and with precision. Its feel and heft are the beginning of the sport's critical dimensions. If it were a fraction of an inch larger or smaller, a few centimeters heavier or lighter, the game of baseball would be utterly different. Hold a baseball in your hand. As it happens, this one is not brand new. Here, just to one side of the curved surgical welt of stitches, there is a pale green grass smudge, darkening on the edge almost to black. The mark of an old infield play, a tough grounder, now lost in memory. Feel the ball. turn it over in your hand, hold it across the seam or the other way with the seam just to the side of your middle finger. Speculation stirs. You want to get outdoors and throw this spare and sensual object to someone, or at the very least, watch someone else throw it. The game has begun. Welcome, everybody, to our discussion of On the Ball. Before I start, I'm not the world's biggest baseball fan, but I will say I am wearing the still reigning NCAA champion Vanderbilt Commodores baseball cap, and I have my very own Cardinals baseball to do a little talk with you today. So let's talk about the essay a little bit. Just some insights that I'd like to share as we're kind of getting to go with this class. So one thing that I would anticipate probably shocks you is that this is an essay, right? So let's get to why this is an essay first. And one thing that you should actually do, I want you to stop the video and write down what are some things that you think makes this an essay. Okay, give you a second to do that. All right, so what makes this an essay? Well, we have some central elements that are really going to work in its favor, right? One thing is it's nonfiction. There's nothing in here that's made up. There's no fictional information. And so that's a major criteria that we deal with in this class that sometimes gets lost in translation, is the information has to be 100% factual or very close to 100% factual. We can kind of split some hairs on that. The second thing that we're doing with this essay is it's actually doing something, right? So if we think about the audience for this essay, who is the audience for this essay? Good question, right? I think we can narrow it down, right? So one thing that I like to do when I talk about audience is we take the whole view, right? Is it everyone in the world? The answer is always no. So can we narrow it down? Well, it's about baseball, right? Baseball is primarily an American sport, although it's played, all over South and Central America. It's played in Japan. It's popular in some other places, but it's essentially an American sport. So I feel pretty safe saying this is for an American audience. It is America's pastime, right? So we kind of have a feeling for that. As people in St. Louis, we might be a little more attuned to baseball because we're a big baseball city. Hence my Cardinals baseball here. And as we talk about thinking about the experience of baseball, right, there's a resonance to it. I'm not sure that this is necessarily gendered, although baseball is a gendered sport, right? We actually have a different sport that's made for women that's basically the same sport. So yeah, I think we could perhaps say that this is a male-driven essay, although I don't think it necessarily has to be. So we have some components of a real audience here. Bart Twain wants to play with the baseball. We have some components of a real audience here, right? And I think there's one moment specifically that I really appreciate about this essay where he kind of says, like, a baseball is meant to be thrown, right? And so there's kind of a nostalgia factor if you ever threw the baseball around with a dad or an older brother or an older sister or a mom, right? Like somebody in your family, if you've had that experience, then it kind of calls up that experience. So we have a little bit of audience kind of brewing. We have a purpose here too, right? Why write about something so descriptively? One thing that I might posit is we have a lot of passion about this thing, right? It's not any old baseball. It's a specific baseball. It's a baseball that had that crazy grounder that caused that grass stain, right? So we have an object of true affection here, which really is a distinctive feature of a descriptive essay, that we have that deep description, that deep sense of purpose inside of the thing. And he kind of talks about that, it is meant to be thrown. The structure of the essay is actually really fantastic, right? I'd say the structure is probably one of the easiest things to understand about this essay because he literally takes the baseball apart and then puts it back together for us, right? Did you know that there were so many components into just baseball is so small and there's so much stuff in there? Did you know that? Did you get the sense that the author really cares about this? There's a lot of care inside of this craft. Um, the other thing that might surprise you about the fact that it's an essay is it's so short, right? It's what, half a page? It's an exceptionally tiny essay, and we're used to thinking of essays as 3 pages, 4 pages, 5 pages. And I think this gets us to something else that's really important, which is if you're meeting your purpose and you're meeting your audience, then something like length doesn't really matter. Um, Now, don't get me wrong, I think this is a heavily revised essay. I can imagine this essay started as at least 3 pages, right? He has cut down word by word by word to get us to the place that we're at towards the end of the essay, which is an incredibly tight sphere of influence. Um, so just some things to consider as we think about on the ball. Now we can go into ethos, pathos, logos. I think there's a whole lot of pathos in here, as we said. There's a nostalgia feel. There's a factor there. There's a certain kind of credibility and how authentic it is, right? How it's been made, how it has to be made this way, otherwise it won't function properly, right? And then we have the logos. It's full of fact. It's full of carefully architectured fact, but it's not the kind of fact that then needs to say, and here's where this source came from, and I needed to quote it. Instead, we have fact that's just built right into the essay in a way that is so assuming that you don't necessarily notice it as an audience member until we start to take it apart. So, on the ball, a fantastic example of a descriptive essay. Certainly an essay type that we could play around with. We're going to have a little bit of fun as we do a descriptive writing activity coming up. And I hope you guys enjoy that a little bit. And I look forward to seeing what you're putting together.